This is Rejected Knowledge, and this is Chapter 9 from Lords of the Press by George Seldes from 1938. Some memory hold history here, Rejected Knowledge, stuff you're not supposed to know. Chapter 9, entitled Lord Baltimore. If integrity is a luxury, it was well exemplified in the case of Van Lear Black and the Baltimore Sun papers. The Sun and the Evening Sun of Baltimore have always been prominent among the few really great newspapers in America, which can be compared with the Manchester Guardian, the old Frankfurter Zeitung, the dead New York World. Parentheses. All these papers, by the way, were rich men's newspapers. The Guardian, owned by C.P. Scott, the Frankfurter by Sonnenmann, the World by Joseph Pulitzer, and the Baltimore papers by Black, end parentheses. Black was probably the richest individual in the state of Maryland. He was president of the Fidelity and Deposit Company of Baltimore, director of the Consolidated Coal Company, the Massachusetts Mutual Life Insurance Company, the American Ship and Commerce Corporation, American Sugar Refining Company, the Chatham Phoenix National Bank, and Trust Company of New York. But did Black present his editors with a list of these corporations with instructions to treat them as sacred cows? Did he instruct his editors to color the news to suit the sugar company or the shipping company? He did not. He not only told his editorial writers, editors, and reporters that they must cover the news truthfully, as most editors do, but he proved to his staff that he was not bluffing, as so many others are doing. The question of the man's integrity is well illustrated in one of the West Virginia coal strikes, where the worst features of labor war in America were to be found, with violence, bloodshed, and murder commonplaces. Mr. Van Lear Black was not only a stockholder in one of the companies, but he was an operator in this field. But that did not deter him from sending two men, a staff reporter and a radical labor advocate, to write the story of the strike. Mr. Black made a bet that when the stories came in, the one from the regular staff man would turn out to be the more radical than that of the radical labor advocate, and he won. But it is to be noted that, 1. The staff man knew he would not be fired, no matter what he wrote, as long as he was convinced it was the truth, and 2. The coal operator published in his own newspaper damning but truthful reports against his own profit interests. Van Lear Black began life as a clerk. In his youth he was interested only in business and finance. He became director of banks, shipping companies, insurance firms. He insured himself for $750,000, and his hobbies were yachting and airplanes. It was as chairman of the board of the A.S. Abel Company, which published the Sun papers, that he became identified with journalism. He never interfered with the capable men he hired to run the papers. It is quite possible that he would never have interfered had the editors made the paper reactionary and servile, but since it is the natural habit of American reporters to produce as free a newspaper as the owner permits, and since in this instance the owner was sympathetic, the result was two great newspapers. Unfortunately, Van Lear Black disappeared from his yacht one night in August 1930. Alive, he had furnished the world press with many stories, notably his 130,000-mile flight to all parts of the world, but in death he furnished a sensation. However, it was soon proved that although he was a drinking man, he had not been drunk, and there was no probability of suicide. The accident had tragic effects on the Sun papers. I wonder if it was really an accident. Continuing. In autumn of 1936, when the reactionary papers joined like howling wolves around a single victim, the New Deal, the two most important deserters from the liberal Democratic camp were the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and the Baltimore Sun papers. Said the Sun, quote, "The Sun now states that in this campaign it is unable to advocate the re-election of President Roosevelt. The statement is made with regret. The Sun stands for competitive capitalism. It is the system which most effectively uproots the unfit, the unworthy, the lazy. It is the system which gives place to the vigorous, the competent, the purposeful." Yeah, but it was already dead by the 1930s. What a bunch of hogwash. The robber baron era was done, and the robber barons had already totally taken over the nation. And then they closed the barn doors with so nobody could get out of the barn and catch them. With the fraudulent antitrust laws, which all that did was let the robber barons who already escalated to the top do whatever the hell they wanted, and nobody else could catch them. That's what that was all about. Yes, I have documentation. Listen to some of my other shows. Continuing. It is the system which constantly provides room for originality and thereby constantly enlarges achievement. It is the system which carries technological advance to its rational conclusion of lower prices and increased mass consumption. Bullcrap. Bullcrap. It leads to monopoly and higher prices. Continuing. Even as distorted in recent periods, it has produced in this country a degree of well-being which has never been equaled, and in that well-being all classes of men have shared. Bullcrap. Within this system, labor may organize and exercise its rights to bargain collectively. Bullcrap. This system of competition is, moreover, the protection of political liberty. Bullcrap. This is all propaganda. Bullcrap. It is the best protection for the ordinary citizen, the working man. Bullcrap. It is the economic freedom of competition which guards political freedom. Unquote. Bullcrap. Wow. 6 weeks later, or just before the dawn of Election Day, the Baltimore Sun announced that it could not support Landon either. But reaction has run the chariot of the Sun ever since. One of its signs was the appointment of H.L. Mencken as editor of the Evening Sun. One of Mr. Mencken's stunts was to publish 6 columns of dots on the 7-column editorial page with the announcement that there were over 1,075 dots, one for every federal government's, quote, immense corps of job holders. If there were no job holders at all, every taxpayer's income would be increased 27%. Such is the bill for being saved from revolution and ruin by wonder men. Unquote. In midsummer 1938, Mr. Mencken, retiring as editor, but continuing as columnist, went to Germany for his holiday. The Sun papers still produce excellent pages, still employ numerous editors and correspondents noted for liberalism and intelligence, but there is no millionaire owner today to encourage the staff to produce a great newspaper at the price of disagreeing with the forces of that, quote, competitive capitalism, unquote, which the staff approves and which it claims uproots the unfit, the unworthy, and the lazy, and which in practice has always kept the American nation a third, ill-fed, ill-clad, and ill-housed even in the good old days of the liberal Van Leer Black. Okay, that was Chapter 9. We're going to take a break and get into Chapter 10 of Lords of the Press by George Seldes. Back in a flash. We're back. Time for Chapter 10 of Lords of the Press by George Seldes from 1938, way out of print. And it's just about, no, not just about, it is certainly the most beat-to-hell library book I have ever tracked down, and I had to look through a lot of libraries to track one of these down. I mean, this thing is falling apart in my hands. Got tape holding it together. Thank goodness they didn't throw it away. Chapter 10, The American Thunderer. Many persons, in addition to its owners, believe the New York Times is the best newspaper in the world. They point to its leadership in international news, its completeness in national news, its impartiality, decency, honesty, and other virtues. But the more they pile on the praise for this newspaper, the more they condemn the press in general, because, all in all, the New York Times is not good enough. The Times does not color and suppress the news in the way most papers do, but it knows how to bury unpleasant items and play up pleasant ones, which is a confession that bias and partiality weigh the news there just as they do in the Hearst press. The editorial page, Mr. Sulzberger assures me, is purposely kept weak and dawdling so as not to affect the news. If a strong editorial stand is taken, every employee from Washington to Moscow will be influenced in how he writes and what he sends. If no editorial policy is emphasized, the staff will be unprejudiced. That is Mr. Sulzberger's theory. He thinks it is working well. Others think it is not working at all. I am absolutely sure that Mr. Sulzberger has convinced himself that he has made the Times completely free, liberal, and impartial. He not only says he is a liberal, he is devoted to liberalism, he is impassioned for democracy, and he cannot possibly see that he is a conservative, and that there is much about the Times that is not only conservative, but Tory, and Toryism means prejudice, bias, unfairness to liberalism and democracy, unfairness to labor, to all progressive movements and their news, and to the forward march of civilization. It is perhaps a job for a psychologist to explain the behavior pattern of the publisher of America's most important and powerful newspaper, to relate education, environment, and upbringing of the man to his confession of liberalism, his delusion in believing that he is producing a great liberal journal, his transcendental failure to do so, and his magnificent success materially. As a reporter, it is merely my job to try to get at the facts, and the most interesting, in my opinion, is the fact that the publisher believes in his own liberalism. No liberal in the past or today has ever considered the Times or its owners as fellow travelers. The evidence has been against them. A test for not only a liberal press, but a free press, can be made by an examination of its news on labor. It is not required that a newspaper claiming to be liberal should also be pro-labor, although that exists among magazines and would not be held against newspapers. When, however, a newspaper slants its news or its headlines, or selects news and plays up news which is inimical to labor, it can be said that that newspaper certainly is not liberal. It may not even be fair. As for red baiting, that attitude puts the Hearst stigmata on a newspaper and requires no more condemnation. How then shall we judge events of May 1938, when big business, which the La Follette Committee had proven the enemy of labor, and William Allen White had admitted engaged in class warfare with labor, began to demand the revision or repeal of the Wagner Act, the annihilation of the National Labor Relations Board, the outlawing of secondary picketing, and perhaps all picketing, and sit-down strikes, and in short the repeal of all the gains of labor made not only under Roosevelt II, but in a century. The American press, with the exception of a small minority, fell in with the plans of big business. A resolution, quote, tentatively adopted by the Chamber of Commerce, unquote, for an investigation of the National Labor Relations Act, made the front page of the Times with a 3-line head. The same day when Knudsen of General Motors predicted a governmental curb on industrial unionism, the World Telegram went into 3-column hysterics. The Post published only a 1-column head over a short piece, and Hearst went saffron with a story headed, "U.S. must stop violence by unions," says Knudsen. The Times the next day, May 6th, again front-paged the story, "Labor Act Repeal Asked by Chamber," which was followed on June 3rd with a front-page story, "Roosevelt is reported planning revision of the National Labor Act." This last story was immediately denied, but all are overplayed anti-labor news items. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court had decided several cases in favor of the law. In the Mackay case, the court recognized the, quote, continuity of employment, unquote, while workers are on strike. The Times said editorially that certain provisions of the Wagner Act had been held legal, but, quote, the country, it seems clear, is coming more and more to recognize that it is the Wagner Act itself, rather than merely its administration by the Labor Board, that is fundamentally in need of change, unquote. If by the country the Times means its clients and supporters, the editorial is a fact. If it means 5 million organized workers, every liberal-thinking man, it is talking nonsense. However, it is a tragic fact that the anti-labor press of the country has built up quite a powerful revisionist following, even among ignorant working men, for whose benefit the law was made. Nor is this the first instance in which a majority of newspapers has so influenced public opinion that the people have acted against their own good or selfish interests. In the general strike of 1934, when the publishers of San Francisco, with the exception of the Scripps Howard News, conspired to break labor, Hearst ordered the press to play up the story of how Britain broke its general strike in 1926. If one searches the columns of the Times, one will find the coincidence in its use of the British story and an editorial on how it was done. Moreover, the Times went the Hearst crowd one better, with a story headed, "Cleveland Broke Strike with Army." On every possible occasion, the Times writes an editorial against picketing. And now that labor has taken to picketing advertisers, the Times joins with the cheap newspapers in a concerted battle to outlaw this weapon. The Times' bias goes over into its letter department. Here are some samples clipped in November 1937. WKA writes that the public is annoyed, quote, by silly demonstrations, foolishness, nuisance, unquote. Richard Janes says the automat picketing is not justified because the strikers are a minority. WHB, who should get a high post when fascism arrives, declares he makes it his business to patronize struck establishments. R.J. Derby writes, quote, I have been doing the same thing, unquote. MFF says, quote, neither yea nor nay, unquote. R.C. O'Brien says picketing promotes disorder. Cyril Brown proposes licenses. Only one letter takes the side of labor. Can it be that no Times readers are pro-labor? The present reader wrote numerous letters under numerous names and got many friends to write in. But not one letter out of 20 favoring picketing was published. Here is one of the suppressed letters. Quote, to the editor of the New York Times, reading all the letters from Times readers protesting picketing, I begin to wonder whether an impartial poll of public opinion would agree with them. All the courts where the issues has been raised have ruled picketing legal. One higher court has ruled picketing legal in time of no strike. There can be no question that those who would deny labor the right to picket are advocating illegal methods. More interesting, I find the mentality which expresses itself in patronizing struck shops to show a contempt for labor and its methods. I have never been able to find an American who admitted himself a fascist, but this is obviously the fascist mentality and the fascist method. After all, it was Squadrismo, or the violent arm of Mussolini's fascist movement, which smashed strikes and picketing, and the cooperative movement in Italy, while in the employ of the employers' associations. I am indeed surprised to find so much fascist mentality in America proclaiming itself American. Grant Singleton, New York, November 28, 1937, unquote. The Times had no room for pro-labor letters, but it found room for a story headed, quote, J. L. Lewis to move near White House, unquote, beginning, quote, John L. Lewis will move 3 blocks nearer to the White House Monday, unquote. This story, it must be admitted, is a good story in the Hearst style. It means nothing. But a Hearst writer could make a sensation out of rumors of Lewis's alleged desire for political power, and the Times makes the insinuation. Again, on the occasion of a Lewis broadcast in which he spoke of, quote, the slaughter of workers paralleling the massacres of Ludlow and Homestead, unquote, the Times asked editorially why he did not include Herron. Why should he? The La Follette Committee had supplied the evidence, parenthesis which the doubting Times put in quotation marks, end parentheses, of massacres of working men by police and by company forces. The fact that working men had once fought among themselves is totally irrelevant. That was not part of the labor struggle. Anti-labor and red-baiting go together. The Times is anti-labor, and there is a lot of evidence with which to build up a case of red-baiting. Here is an example. On August 26, 1935, the Times had a story, quote, See clue to firebug in nurse's notebook. Denver police find leaves at 3 blazes and suspect communist group, unquote. The police chief, Captain James E. Childers, was quoted saying, quote, "It is possible that a communist organization with a hatred of religion and of men who own large buildings and hotels is attempting to spread a reign of terror," unquote. 3 Catholic churches had been set on fire. To publish such charges against a legal, recognized political party is not good journalism. One cannot imagine the Democratic Times ever referring to a Republican organization as engaged in arson, and to publish the true story the next day without reference to the red-baiting lie of the previous day is not fair journalism. The fact was that a pyromaniac, a boy named Warren Kramer, confessed setting 24 fires for fun. Again, the Times, October 14th, 1936, had a scoop with a wild tale about hundreds of communists running wild in the textile district. Commissioner Valentine, who in his time had conducted numerous red raids, called the stories a lot of bunk, quote unquote. The Times kept quiet. A later Times scoop, with a 2-column head, quote, "Miss Point's disappearance laid to kidnapping, here for Soviet," unquote, made the front page in the midst of a spy scare. There were columns of sensationalism credited to the Italian radical leader Carlo Tresca, who is anti-Soviet. Miss Pointz's attorney, Elias Lieberman, is also quoted. The next day, the World Telegram quoted the attorney, saying the story was, quote-unquote, purely imaginative, and by the time Tresca came before the investigating grand jury, the Times polished the story off with about 6 inches of police reporting. There was nothing to the story. The red-baiting boomerang did the Times no credit. Neither did its December 17th, 1937 story of the arrest of a burglar, which it headed, quote, "Red Leader Arrested in Social Tax Thefts," unquote. It was a good story, but as Cyril Brown once said in Berlin, quote, "The best stories are not necessarily true," unquote. There are many other illustrations. Nevertheless, I would not say that the Times is now, quote, "one of the most impassioned red-baiters," unquote, as Oswald Garrison Villard found it was in reporting the 1919 steel strike, nor is it consistently red-baiting today, as it was when campaigning against Charles A. Lindbergh Sr. It has dropped its red-baiting campaign against Russia, but it somehow cannot escape fits of red-baiting. The test will come soon because labor is inevitably going left, and business corporations, as well as cheap jack politicians, purposely confuse militant labor with red ideology. One of the tests by which a reader can tell whether the press is not only liberal or conservative, but fair to its customers, is the manner in which it reports congressional and Federal Trade Commission investigations. Throughout our history, and we have only to think back to those of most recent date, notably the Teapot Dome, the Nye munitions, and the La Follette Civil Liberties investigations, these extramural activities by committees of the Senate and the House have unearthed tremendous scandals, the worst corruption, the most flagrant examples of injustice and lawbreaking, and they have also supplied the press with many of its most prolonged sensations. It would have been natural to suppose that the newspapers, many of which also engage in attacking vice, corruption, and law-breaking, and all of which protest their aim is to serve the American public by telling it the truthful facts of public life, would have welcomed all congressional investigations, and notably those which supplied the biggest headlines. But the opposite is more often true. Of course, the exposure of the $25 million press corruption fund operated by the National Electric Light Association got little, if any, space in the newspapers because so many of them were directly involved. But when merchants of death were exposed, and a member of the cabinet caught taking a $100,000 bribe, that was news that sells the papers, that rivals wars and lovers' quarrels. The press has not been friendly. Senator Wheeler, during the Black Lobby investigation, invited his colleagues not to, quote, get too excited about what the newspapers say about these investigations and investigating committees, unquote, suggesting that an examination be made of the cartoons and editorials which were published about Senator Walsh, which would show, quote, that the press of the country was almost unanimously against the committee and strongly denounced my colleague, unquote. Yet after the investigation was over, and after the situation had been exposed, and it was known that Fall had accepted money from Doheny, then the same respectable press which had denounced Senator Walsh during the time the investigation was going on, after the public had been aroused by the exposures made by the committee, all proclaimed Senator Walsh a great man. Quote, likewise, in the so-called Doherty investigation, which I helped to conduct, every paper in the United States, almost without exception, both the old guard Democratic papers and the old guard Republican papers, denounced me, denounced the investigation, and wrote editorials upholding and supporting Harry M. Doherty, until the investigation got to the point where the papers could not longer stand it. That continued, and eventually they were compelled to switch over, unquote. Quote, as a matter of fact, during the investigation, the Associated Press would carry what the committee brought out during the hearings, and above that they would carry every night a story as to what Doherty said, and what his comment was upon the committee's hearings. They repeatedly, through the press, denounced me for not calling Doherty, and when I finally did ask him to come before the committee, and he refused to come, there was hardly a single editorial denouncing him until after he had been reluctantly thrown out of office by President Coolidge. Almost the entire press of the country was against both the Walsh investigation and the Doherty investigation, unquote. Quote, if it had not been for those investigations, most of those men would have continued to hold public office. Most of them would have continued to carry on their thievery. Most of them would have gone on exploiting public domain, and most of them would have gone on debauching the government of the United States. And yet I say it is a sad commentary that the press of the country, both Republican and Democratic, denounce every investigation carried on by the Congress of the United States. I wish to say, for my part, that I feel that one of the most beneficial things the Senate has done since I have been in Congress has been to expose corruption and crookedness in high places, and likewise to expose the corrupting influences that are used to oppose the passage of legislation in the interest of the masses of the people of the United States. The Senate has done more, in my opinion, to preserve a democracy in this country through those investigations than almost anything else. If it were not for the investigatory powers of Congress and the fear of exposure on the part of some individuals high up in some of the industries of the country, our government would not last very long. Bullcrap. I think the members of the Black Committee are to be congratulated upon the work they have carried on, and I do not think they should take very seriously what Mr. Hearst says, or what the owner of the Washington Post says. The people of the country desire to have these things exposed, and they desire to have crookedness shown up." Unquote. Senator Wheeler's statement can be backed up by historical facts. The Pujo, the Peckora, the Nye munitions, the Walsh, and the present La Follette investigations, to name but a few, have produced the evidence of corruption and frequently resulted in good laws. A crook named Fall went to jail, but the big businessmen who bribed him were unfortunately not discovered by the Teapot Dome investigation. Go figure, huh? Yet in this instance, as in almost every instance without exception, the New York Times has begun by ridiculing the investigation committee and ended by minimizing its findings. I know of no big newspaper in America which has so bad and consistent a record in opposing investigations. I cannot imagine why this is so, except perhaps the fact that every investigation exposes the corruption of men and organizations who represent power and riches, and the Times is fundamentally the paper of the people of the same class of society. I have already told in Freedom of the Press how Mr. Ox had boasted that, quote, American newspapers, with whatever faults and defects they may have been charged, are not open to the accusation of venality, unquote, just before a Senate committee heard Frederick Bonfils of the Denver Post admit he had blackmailed oil men for $1 million to suppress the first news of the Teapot Dome scandal, and John C. Schaefer, then owner of the Chicago Evening Post, Indianapolis Star, Muncie Star, Terre Haute Star, and Rocky Mountain News, testify he had received $92,500. Ox's Times even then declared that the senators making the investigation acted, quote, like men who at heart are enemies of lawful and orderly government, unquote, suggesting that the object of the probe was, quote, to paralyze the administration, terrorize members of the cabinet, and to break down the efficiency of the government, unquote. Mr. Ox's Times called the investigators, quote, scandalmongers and assassins of character, unquote. This was absolutely false. The investigators, as we now know, sent criminals to jail and saved the oil reserve for the United States Navy. If the Times was at fault in the Teapot Dome case, it was even more culpable in the Nye munitions investigation, when its great and good friend, the J.P. Morgan Company, was discussed and found an important factor in bringing America into the World War. This is a complicated subject, and I offer an enormous documentation to any student seeking material for an interesting thesis. Here I can give only a few facts concerning the Times. In the autumn of 1935, Senator Nye recalled the fact that President Wilson had admitted that the World War was a commercial and industrial war. There it is. Wow. Quote, to state that America went into the last war to help American commercial and banking interests is in itself too bold a statement to command a hearing, unquote. Nye continued in a radio address, adding that it was necessary, quote, to state the step-by-step course through which these commercial and banking interests led us to war, unquote. This he proceeded to do. He discussed at length the quote-unquote Morgan credits and the tie-up with the State Department. Finally, he read the famous Page telegram, which warned of a great panic because, quote, the approaching crisis has gone beyond the ability of Morgan, unquote, and urged, quote, our going to war, unquote, as, quote, the only way in which our present preeminent trade position can be maintained and a panic averted, unquote. Concluded Senator Nye, quote, and so into the war we went, not to make the world safe for democracy, but to prevent a panic, unquote. The Morgan firm was scheduled to give testimony early in January 1936. In December 1935, Kenneth Crawford, staff correspondent of the New York Post, wrote a story with the banner line, Allies' Loans Put U.S. into War, and Raymond Clapper, Scripps Howard's staff writer, appeared in the World Telegram under the headline, Inquiry to Show Morgan Strong Factor in War. From that time on, the Times began its defense of Morgan. Take, for example, the papers of January 7th. The Times has, quote, Morgan defends financing in war, unquote. And the Post has, quote, Morgan accused of hampering probe, unquote. The testimony of the 8th was worth headlines in every newspaper that night and the next morning. Here they are. The Post. Morgan gave U.S. secrets to English in 15, Nye says. World Telegram. Morgan interests bared in 363 million wars sales. New York American. Morgan arms sales aided war. Senate probers charge. New York Sun. Senators read Morgan cable inviting Britain to buy arms plant here in January 1916. New York Tribune. Morgan shown averting tie-up in war supplies from U.S. to Allies in 16. New York Times. Allied financing arms plant deals told by Morgan. The Tribune published no editorial. The Post said, quote, we don't believe that J.P. Morgan and Company deliberately set out to involve this country. Morgan was merely the instrument by which the United States was linked to Europe's cataclysm, unquote. The World Telegram, asking for measures against a repetition of a world war, says that Morgan showed how the fortunes of his house, quote, deeply rooted though it was, and is still in the economic life of this country, were involved with the war fortunes of the Allies, unquote. The Times, on the 8th, tried the comic approach. In its Topics of the Times column, it said, quote, it really wasn't the munitions makers and bankers who took us into the war on the side of the Allies, but the theatrical managers and equity, unquote. Because there were, quote, nearly a dozen English shows recently in town, unquote. But the next morning there was a leading editorial, quote, Senator Nye may be an amiable and sincere gentleman, but he is a little on the credulous order. He swallows scandalous rumors greedily, and puts the plate of evidence away untouched. In several addresses during the past summer and autumn, he recited charges against J.P. Morgan and Company. That firm had, according to the senator, followed an iniquitous course all through the first years of the Great War, and had finally, in a desperate effort to collect its foreign loans, dragged the Wilson administration and the country into the war. When the actual test of these assertions came before the Senate committee, a plain tale put most of them down as wild or ridiculous, unquote. The editorial attack on Nye and defense of Morgan continued almost daily. In the committee's discoveries, the sensational disclosures which were making banner lines throughout the world were called, quote-unquote, familiar history, and the proceedings, quote, possibly a little wearying, unquote. In, quote, instructive irrelevancies, unquote, it was stated that the, quote, committee delving into the affairs of the Morgans has taken up questions which are irrelevant and immaterial. Everybody can see that and infer what was the motive for it. Some senators still believe in a kind of political demonology. To them it seems impossible that important events can have happened without a sinister and wicked person controlling and directing them for his own nefarious reasons, unquote. In Inquiry Unlimited, January 16th, the Times suggests that the hearings, having proven dull, be discontinued. States the editorial, quote, one reason is that their personal and financial sensations have all been exploded with little or no damage, unquote. It maintains that, quote, the endeavor to prove that only the profit motive drew the United States into the war in 1917, quote, left the committee confused and baffled, unquote. Of the falsification regarding the secret treaties charged to Wilson, the editorial said, quote, irrelevant if true, unquote, and, quote, more matter of that kind will soon justify the committee in putting up the shutters, unquote. That same day, the, quote, topics of the Times, unquote, said with its usual elephantine attempt at humor that, quote, the shrewd men on the Nye Committee will not be deceived, unquote, by Morgan's statement in favor of the purple heather and grouse shooting in Scotland. Quote, this grouse situation must be looked into, unquote. In defense of the Times, it could be said that its treatment of Morgan was not as servile as that of other newspapers, if that fact can be a defense. The Sun, January 15th, 1936, reported that, quote, Nye exonerates Morgan of wrong, unquote, and the Herald Tribune, on the 19th, in a leading editorial, quote, Morgan turns the tables, unquote, said, Mr. Morgan, to his credit be it said, has turned the tables on Senator Nye and the other inquisitors who, during the last few weeks, have been doing their best to prove that he was a liar, a scoundrel, a traitor, and a bloodthirsty and greedy knave. As the committee's work is approaching its end, Senators Nye and Clark are the discredited ones, and Mr. Morgan's integrity and character have been blazoned before the nation. May the Senator's experience serve as a warning that the country is tired of smearing campaigns, even when the objects of vilification have for so many years been maligned misrepresented and manhandled, as is the case with the members of the House of Morgan, unquote. What a beautiful example of bought-off news right there. Oh, wow. The climax to the Times campaign against Nye came when the inquiry ended and the senator gave the lie direct to a Times editorial. This paper had said, February 9th, 1936, under the heading, "An Inquiry Ends Well," that Nye had predicted he would prove inter alia that the Morgan firm, quote, in order to save its own loans, had used its powerful influence to induce the Washington government to take this country into the struggle against Germany, unquote. The Times adds, quote, "The prolonged and searching investigation utterly failed to prove that there was any real foundation for these charges. Indeed, the inquiry ended on a sort of jovial note of congratulations between Mr. Morgan and his friend Nye." Unquote. Quote, "Such an outcome is of great public benefit. It verified the statement made by one of the committee's own examiners. I don't see that the Morgans did anything wrong at all." It is easy to imagine the disturbing effect if a contrary result had been reached. People would despairingly have concluded that there was something rotten in the whole banking business. You think? As it was, the firm under scrutiny was shown to have conducted its affairs honorably. The way in which it emerged from the investigation, without the smell of fire upon its garments, is a good thing not only for J.P. Morgan and Company, but for the country, unquote. Sorry, I have a hard time reading that with a straight face. This editorial is at variance with the Nye statements, acts and reports, and as well as historical accuracy. Senator Nye electrified a large audience by publicly denying the Times statements and views. Morgan was not cleared. There was no whitewash. There was no jovial note of congratulation, but a formal diplomatic handshake, and exactly every item the Times said was not proven had been proven. Quote, "There appeared one day last week," unquote, said Senator Nye to an audience which applauded him and booed Morgan and the Times, quote, "in the greatest independent newspaper in the country, the story that our examination of the Morgan partners was concluded with a handshaking all around and a general agreement we had wound up by whitewashing the Morgan interest. There is not a single member of the Senate Committee of the Inquiry that believes the inquiry has afforded a clean bill of health to the House of Morgan. It would not be fair to say that the House of Morgan took us to war to save their investment in the Allies, but the record of facts makes it altogether fair to say that these bankers were in the heart and center of a system that made our going to war inevitable." Unquote. That is a powerful statement. Wow. Yeah, the bankers. They make our going to war inevitable. In the 20th century, certainly. The money changers. Our fiat currency system makes going to war inevitable. Perpetual war. War is peace. Continuing. Essentially, this was the report of the committee. It found that the House of Morgan held a key position to influence government policy in the first years of the war, and while it did not quote-unquote drag the country in, it helped steer the nation into a position which made its entry inevitable. Two historians who are expert on this subject agree. Walter Millis writes that, quote, great sections of American industry and finance, led by the Morgan firm, devoted themselves to establishing the economic complex which tended constantly thereafter to thrust the nation more and more deeply into an economic alliance with the Entente, and consequently nearer and nearer to war with Germany, unquote. This is fascinating, folks, because here I'm reading in Lords of the Press by George Seldes, 1938, I'm reading that the House of Morgan, the Morgan banking interests, steered us into World War I. And I read in Dr. Ferdinand Lundberg's book, The Rich and the Super Rich, from 1967, he documents how it was the DuPonts and their interests in gunpowder and munitions that steered us into World War I. So you got the DuPonts, you got the Morgans. Who do you think got us into the war? It's all of these oligarch money changers. And yet you have evangelicals today sending their sons and daughters, and now daughters, off to be cannon fodder, and believing that these are just wars overseas. Continuing, and Dr. Harry Elmer Barnes, who believes that the communists must have shouted with joyous derision when the Morgan testimony ended, says that the evidence produced by the Nye Committee and Baker's latest volume on Wilson, quote, makes it perfectly clear that no single factor was so powerful in bringing the United States into the World War as the bankers' pressure on the government to permit the extension of unlimited credit to the Allies. So you got a credit system. A debt-driven system produces wars. And you have people proclaiming Jesus Christ like financial teacher Dave Ramsey out there, who is endorsing our debt-ridden system. He's telling you how to get out of debt, but then how to deal with usury more properly and mortgages more wisely. And not telling you the fundamental heinous nature of this system, unscriptural, anti-Christian nature of the system. Continuing, obviously there is no personal devil. Obviously, it is not J.P. Morgan who took America into the war, but something even bigger than Morgan, and that something, of course, is a combination of big business, finance capital, and the profit motive. Since it is a fact that the Morgan House has no financial interest or any control over the Times, it is only fair to infer that it is the Times' general interest in the same ideals which Morgan represents, which drove it, editorially, to the limit of distortion and unfairness in discussing the Nye investigation. Coincident with that event was a series of letters begun by the Morgan partner, Thomas Lamont, which sought to exonerate the bankers. I can state on my own authority that the Times suppressed numerous letters taking issue with Lamont, and published over a long period many letters supporting him, all of which Morgan republished and distributed. Some of the letters dealt with a matter of historical fact. Did or did not Woodrow Wilson, in his St. Louis speech in July 1919, admit that, quote, this was an industrial and commercial war, unquote? This is fascinating. Because if George Seldes is documenting all of these causes of World War I, he's doing so in 1938, right before World War II. And, gee, guess who caused that one too? Continuing, I had first come across this statement in Falsehood in Wartime by Lord Ponsonby, and verified it in the columns of the New York Times of September 6th, 1919, where the story is on the front page and the text on page 2, column 4. I sent this important fact, which would have decided the controversy, to the Times, and my wife wrote another letter which she signed Helen Larkin and mailed from another town. But the Times suppressed both and let the controversy continue, although it had the solution in its own files. The solution, however, was not gratifying to those who want to preserve the myth of patriotism about the World War, and who are fearful of having economic truth published. On April 8, 1936, the Times made an occasion for again denouncing investigations in general. It said that, quote, in the long run, the abusive powers of investigation carries precisely as great risk for the radical or the liberal as for the reactionary or the conservative. Today it is the power trust or the bankers' lobby that faces an investigating committee which makes its own rules and intimidates its witnesses. Tomorrow it may be a socialist newspaper or a strike committee, unquote. The investigation of the Power Trust, it so happens, brought out the evidence of the $25 million a year bribe fund to corrupt the American press. The investigation of the lobbies, of the banking system, of the munitions industry, of big business and its employment of thugs and murderers as strikebreakers, and in fact all investigations of the recent past and present have had the approval of all liberal elements and nothing but the disapproval and at times sabotage from conservative and reactionary elements, notably the press. Socialist papers, strike committees, have nothing to fear from a congressional investigation. The Times argument is nonsense. But the meanest of all Times editorial attacks was made in December 24th, 1937, when the La Follette Civil Liberties Committee, having published 14 volumes of testimony and documents, which constitute the most complete indictment of American big business as a lawbreaker, parentheses, through the employment of thugs, the use of violence, and the denial of civil rights to American labor, end parentheses, added to the evidence a list of 2,500 individuals or companies using spies. There were exactly 8 challenges, of which 6 were immediately answered by documentary evidence. One case was admitted as mislisted. The company should have been charged with employing a guard, not a spy. In one instance, the committee was looking up the facts. At most, the committee could have made 2 mistakes in 2,500 investigations. But the Times, traditionally hostile to all investigations, attacked without getting the facts or reading the documents. The senators would not let the challenge go unanswered. Here, in parallel columns, slightly abbreviated, is the Times editorial and the reply. So here first is the one on the left. Hair-trigger charges. The La Follette two-man committee accused 2,500 business firms of employing labor spies. It mentioned these companies by name. Several of them immediately protested that they never used spies of any sort. In reply to these protests, Senator La Follette blandly admits that he never really checked the matter up. The committee, in short, admits that no careful check was made regarding any individual firms, yet it did not hesitate to defame each individual firm by accusing it of employing spies. In the face of this amazing admission, what confidence can anyone place in the committee's report? The other column on the right, defending the industrial espionage report. This wholly unwarranted effort to impugn the credibility of an 18-month study by this committee, so fully and accurately reported in your news columns, is based upon the inference that, quote-unquote, numerous employers have successfully denied statements in the report. Since the middle of last March to the publication of the report, only one firm protested to this committee that it had been improperly listed. In the investigation of such magnitude, where the very nature of the activities examined were shrouded in secrecy and duplicity, so small a number of complaints is in itself evidence of the thoroughness and care with which the committee has undertaken its work. That more protests were not filed is surprising. The information has been checked against all available data. The committee has additional data in its files. Out of the 8 firms either denying the accuracy of the committee's list or requesting further information, 6 were found in the committee's records either to have used industrial espionage or to have contributed to an association making espionage services available to its members. In view of this record and the report of the committee, we can see no basis for the unwarranted inferences drawn by the New York Times in its recent editorial, signed Senator Robert M. La Follette, Jr. and Senator Elbert Thomas, unquote. Moreover, the Times charge that La Follette blandly admits he never really checked the matter up is not true. Neither is it true that the committee admits no careful check was made regarding any individual firms. But it so happens that the list of 2,500 firms represent what has been called, quote, a blue book of American industry, unquote. It includes the largest advertisers in the Times and other papers, notably General Motors, Chrysler, General Electric, Borden, Kellogg, National Dairy, Quaker Oats, Swift, National Biscuit, Frigidaire, Aluminum Company, Lever Brothers, Parker Pen Company, Standard Oil, Bethlehem Steel, Pennsylvania Railroad, Consolidated Gas, Radio Corporation, American Locomotive, Pullman, A&P Tea Company, F.W. Woolworth, Montgomery Ward and Company. Numerous big advertising department stores such as Gimbel Brothers, Lord and Taylor, John Wanamaker. But I would not accuse the Times of venality. Neither would I say that it is just a dozen coincidences that in a dozen cases the same paper has been defending men and corporations who are the outstanding symbols of the big business system, and who are almost always guilty of unsocial acts. Surely it is no exaggeration to say that the Times policy in all these instances has been that of a reactionary paper. The liberal press, notably the New Republic and Nation, have, in all these instances, accused the Times of unfairness. I bring this matter to the attention of Mr. Sulzberger as refutation to his claim, made to me personally that the Times is a liberal newspaper. It is not. It is a reactionary newspaper. Moreover, it is, at times, even worse than reactionary. At times, it is obscurantist. Mr. Sulzberger repeats Mr. Ox's statement that the press is not venal. The point need not be argued so far as it affects the Times. The Times is not venal. It does not suppress news at the request of advertisers. It does not violate the ethics of journalism for pay. And it frequently prints news which both advertisers in the Times and the venal class, with which the Times is associated, would have preferred to have suppressed. How, then, account for the following facts? For the few examples which I quote out of a dossier of several hundred, all gathered since 1935, when the Times was criticized in Freedom of the Press. On the morning of November 25th, 1937, readers who bought both the Democratic Times and the Republican Herald Tribune found these items. Herald Tribune: Chrysler cuts payrolls, auto production off. Times: Chrysler cuts work. The Herald Tribune heading in 3 lines in large type was followed by a long story, and most important of all, was sensationally played up on page 1. The Times story was a single-line head, followed by 3 or 4 inches of news, and completely buried alive on page 32, bottom. If the Herald Tribune can be accused of overplaying the story because of its hatred for the administration, the Times, on the other hand, can justly be accused of semi-suppression of an important news item. Whether this was done out of friendship for the administration or respect to a big advertiser, we do not know, but the episode is typical. Continuing the comparison of the quote-unquote liberal Times and the Tory Herald Tribune, here are 2 more startling instances. One concerns the arrest and imprisonment of Haywood Broun, president of the Newspaper Guild, during a strike in Milwaukee. Both papers carry the same Associated Press report, but the Times did not have the courage to include this paragraph, quote, "Anyone who thinks we have a free press is not a wise newspaper reader," said Broun. "Newspapers are the first line of defense of entrenched capital, and William Randolph Hearst is the epitome, the symbol of entrenched greed in the United States," unquote. Of course, this statement may have been cut for lack of space. In reporting the suicide of George C. Hansen, famed American diplomatic quote-unquote troubleshooter and former consul general in Moscow, the Times had about twice as much room as the Herald Tribune to reprint Hansen's last letter, first published in the Bridgeport Times-Star, in which, quote, he accused New York bankers of meddling in State Department affairs for their own advantage, unquote. Gee, you think? But the Times suppressed the name of the bank. And on the left here is the article as it appeared in the Times. Times. "The sources and motivation of these charges I can only conclude are not disinterested. I would hesitate to believe that the blank blank bank is attempting to interfere with American government appointments." Here is, on the right, the article as it appeared in the Herald Tribune. Herald Tribune. "The sources and motivation of these charges I can only conclude are not disinterested. I would hesitate to believe that the Chase National Bank is attempting to interfere with American government appointments." May Day is always a difficult time for the Times. On that day, rather than Labor Day, organized labor generally marches in New York City, and the left-wing elements of labor usually predominate. In 1936, the Times reported, 40,000 march here in May Day parade, quietest in years. Whereas the Post, favorable to labor, reported that between 200,000 and 250,000 marched. May Day 1938 was even worse for the New York Times. Dr. Ernest Meyer of the Post suggested that the tabulators should have gotten together on this because the results were Times, 50,000, Sunday News, over 100,000, Herald Tribune, between 50 and 100,000, and the Communist Daily Worker a triumphant 200,000. Mr. Meyer said that the matter was of no tremendous significance because, quote, among papers of such various shades of political slant, one cannot expect a united front of adding machines, unquote. In December 1937, the Federated Press, the Guild Reporter, and the New York Post joined in accusing the Times of suppressing that part of the speech by Mariner S. Eccles, chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, in which he expressed opposition to the repeal of the undistributed profits and capital gains taxes, two things which both Mr. Sulzberger and the Times editorial policy are bitterly decided upon. It is interesting to note that both the Associated Press and the United Press placed Eccles's remarks on profits and gains first, but the Times' leading paragraph said, quote, labor and industry were warned today that restrictive practices raising cost were responsible for the present decline, unquote. It is also interesting to note that other newspapers opposed to the administration and the taxes carried fair headlines. Here are some examples compared to the Times. Baltimore Sun, Eccles urges retention of profit tax principle. Washington Post, save principle of profits tax, Eccles pleads. New York Times, Eccles urges cuts in building costs. In all primary voting and elections since the labor movement began to enter politics, the Times has also had considerable difficulty in reporting the facts and commenting on them fairly. In Pennsylvania, in May 1938, for instance, the headlines and editorials of the Blue Stocking Times and the Yellow Hearst sheets were almost identical. Apparently their anti-CIO policies do coincide. But comparing the Times with the pro-administration Post, it is obvious that one of the two is far from being fair or accurate. The Times headline was, Pennsylvania results blow to New Deal and its chiefs. Republicans see new hope. And editorially, the Times said, quote, another CIO campaign has become a cropper. The attempt to use industrial unionism as a means of acquiring political power has failed ingloriously. Mr. Lewis has been rebuffed by the Democratic voters. His candidates ran behind even in some of the coal mining districts, unquote. The Post, denouncing the, quote, pitiful efforts of the Tory press to find a New Deal defeat in the Pennsylvania election, unquote, put forth these claims. The New Deal gained ground. No vestige of a New Deal reverse can be found. Almost 1,300,000 voted in the Democratic primary, the highest previous Democratic primary turnout. In 1934 was 569,000. The CIO made a sensational showing. Try to find this in the reactionary press. Kennedy carried the entire state outside of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. Most startling, The CIO candidate carried the rural counties. He lost the election by less than 66,000 votes. Kennedy lost solely because of the opposition, the machine's power, and the labor's split. Other unions did not support CIO. The New York Daily News has already exposed the Times' opinion of the press department for failure to print the news editorials after asking them repeatedly. A similar charge against the Times could be made regarding its letter department. It is not conducted fairly. I have mentioned this fact to Mr. Sulzberger, and found he is under the impression that there is no gerrymandering going on in those columns, but from personal experience as well as the reports of numerous persons, I can produce considerable evidence that the same sort of editing, of selection, and of suppression goes on in this supposedly harmless field as elsewhere. Needless to say, the majority of letters published are innocuous, favorable to the policies of the Times, or generally reactionary. Liberal letter writers have the utmost difficulty in crashing the Times. Is Mr. Sulzberger aware of the fact that Malcolm Cowley of the New Republic, John Langdon Davies, the noted British writer, Lillian Hellman, James Waterman Wise, Richard Watts, Jr. of the Herald Tribune, H.V. Kaltenborn, and others have been refused permission to answer Ellery Sedgwick in the letter columns of the Times? Then there is the matter of delay. The Times news columns called the International Labor Defense, quote, a communist left-wing organization, unquote. Its head, former Congressman Vito Marcantonio, immediately wrote to say, quote, this statement is incorrect. The ILD is not affiliated with any political party, nor does it inquire into the political affiliations of any of its 300,000 members, unquote. Ethically, this statement should have been given the same space and place as the original story. It certainly should have been published the next morning. But the Times letter editor kept it 7 days until its timeliness was over. Under Mr. Ox, the Times valiantly defended the American oil interests and attacked the liberal labor reformist, anti-dictatorial regime of Carranza, Obregon, and Calles. It did not defend invasion and annexation, as the Chicago Tribune did, but it upheld the dollar sign just as vigorously. Mr. Ox probably did not know that one of his correspondents in Mexico City was accused by the Mexican government of telegraphing biased anti-Mexican news because he had been refused an oil concession. In 1927, Mr. Charles Merz, who had collaborated with Walter Lippmann 7 years earlier in exposing the perverted news and downright lies about the Russian Soviets in their first 3 years, made a survey of the news from Mexico. He showed that the Times story, "Spread of Disorders Alarms Mexico," was nothing but a murder and 2 holdups in 3 days, a record far below Chicago's. When the oil laws were put into effect, the Times headline was, "Mexico is pictured on brink of revolt." January 24th, 1927, the Times had a story of a big effort to overthrow the regime, which was nothing but a statement from Adolfo de la Huerta, who was in exile in the United States. On March 31st, 1938, under the liberal Sulzberger regime, I find this story: people of Mexico held misled on oil. The Cardenas government had finally put into effect the constitutional rights of 1917, which Calles made a bluff of enforcing in 1927. British and American oil interests, whose holdings had been proven 90% usurpations, and who were now legally dispossessed, were attempting to use the Foreign Office and the State Department and to threaten with armies and navies if their private property was harmed. It was the old story of private property versus human rights, and as usual, all the material interests, including, of course, the press, were aligned against human interests. Fortunately, however, the Roosevelt administration is not playing the game of the British Foreign Office as regards Mexico, but the Times is still anti-Mexican. You know, I can't share George Seldes' high opinion of FDR. He's sounding kind of LaRouchian here. Precursor of the LaRouchians, the LaRouchites, whatever. Man, wish he'd get off the FDR New Deal thing and just tell us about the press, corruption of the press here. Returning. Under the headline quoted, which does not say who holds the Mexican people, quote-unquote, misled on oil, the Times news columns, after stating that there is a censorship and that the people do not know the facts, adds that, quote, this is the conclusion reached by oil companies here yesterday, unquote. There is no further indication of what oil companies or what officials. The story remains anonymous. It is, moreover, tendentious and purely propagandistic. As any members of the Institute for Propaganda Analysis at Columbia University can testify, Columbia's going to know a lot about propaganda, I'll give you that. It ranks with Hearst's anti-Mexican tainted news. The Guild Reporter calls attention of all American newspapermen to the fact that the Times headline, High Court Passes Closed Shop Issue, on March 1st, 1938, was absolutely correct, and that in a late edition this head was changed to Transit Workers Lose in High Court, which, says the reporter, quote-unquote, created a false impression. Dorothy Dunbar Bromley tells the story of the Keep America Out of War Congress of 1,000 delegates in Washington, at which American diplomatic intrigue with British Tories was incidentally exposed. The Associated Press sent out the news. The Times is, of course, pledged to American Anglo friendship. It failed to mention the event for 3 days. The Herald Tribune did publish a story following cabled requests from noted participants. The Times also likes to minimize scholastic peace movements. Its April 26, 1936 editorial said that the anti-war demonstrations that year, quote, were not so large and impressive as had been predicted, unquote, whereas the facts announced later showed that 500,000 had participated, or double the number of 1935, and considerably more than predicted by student organizers. For a final example of the handling, or rather mishandling, of news here is the instance of a famous speech by Senator Borah. Credit must be given the Times for publishing Borah's statement that, quote, the most revolting instance of mass murder in all history, unquote, was that committed by the Catholic General Franco, who sent his aviators to kill innocent women and children in Guernica. He added, quote, Guernica was not a single instance. It was simply a culmination of a long line of unspeakable atrocities, unquote, by the Spanish clerico-fascists and their German and Italian fellow murderers. Credit must also be given the Times for publishing that part of Senator Borah's statement in which he avers that the advocates of fascism are insidious, subtle, and powerful in America. That fascism, quote, has far more supporters in this country than communism, and they are much more active and much more adroit," unquote. But the fact still remains that the Herald Tribune published the following paragraph, and the Times did not. It read, quote, "The centralization of wealth and the centralization of political power go hand in hand to form the basis for fascism," unquote. Here, in other words, was an instance where the tremendous pressure being put forth by the American Catholic hierarchy to suppress all news unfavorable to Franco, whom even the Pope himself has rebuked for his massacres. Yeah, right. Come on. Nice show. Theatrics. Has failed to operate, whereas quote-unquote wealth and quote-unquote power, which have no official or organized pressure group working in the Times office, but which nevertheless pervade the very air. The prince of the power of the air. Were effective in editing the news. The Times is, of course, a big business. It represents an investment of millions, a gross income of between $20 and $30 million a year, and a net profit of several millions a year. But that fact is not as important as the fact that, in addition to being a big business organization, it is the organ of big business. To be liberal, a newspaper need not be the enemy of big business, but it must at least be free to criticize. The Times has never attempted that. It takes the part of attorney for big business. Whatever laws are the enemies of big business are the enemies of the Times. Whatever actions are favorable to big business receive the applause of the Times. It opposes every congressional investigation. It opposes the laws which the American Federation of Labor and the Committee for Industrial Organization favor, and when the Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers express a wish, the Times turns a somersault. Can all these things be coincidences? Every employee in every department knows that the Times is the organ of big business. When the editor of the letters department destroys 99% of the letters favoring picketing and fills his columns with letters 99% of which oppose picketing, he is not doing so under instructions from Mr. Sulzberger or Colonel Adler. He is doing so because he is a smart man and knows where the capitalistic butter is churned. Very rarely is the bias flagrant. The lay reader may not notice it at all. The Times, for example, can give nice space to Tom Girdler, one of Labor's chief enemies. Parentheses. Girdler says foes of capitalism err, June 5th, 1938. End parentheses. And no space to more important minds. The Times has tried to explain away its failure to publish the news of the impending failure of the Bank of the United States, but it had nothing to say when, quote-unquote, Guy Fawkes, in the New Yorker, caught it protecting the successor to Charles E. Mitchell at the National City Bank by misquoting him. The Times believes it is, quote-unquote, good news that the Roosevelt administration is settling its controversy with the public utility industry, and on May 26, 1937, the Times published a column report of a statement by its financial editor under the heading, "Capitalism is seen on firm base again. Sound working system held responsible for recovery and advance by A.D. Noyes. God's in his heaven. All's right with the world and the Times." In concluding my criticism of the New York Times in Freedom of the Press, I said that, quote, A wonderful opportunity presents itself to Messrs. Arthur Hayes Sulzberger and Julius Ox Adler, whose names now grace the masthead of the Times. If they have the character and courage and an enlightened intelligence, they can easily surpass their predecessor. They must not, as so many Times men do, merely worship at the shrine of Adolph Ox. Ox did many things to make the Times the most important paper in America, and that is no mean accomplishment. But there are still vast improvements to be made, not so much in quality of news, but under the headings of the canons of journalism: sincerity, truthfulness, impartiality, fair play. I hope to see the Times some day as great as it is important." Unquote. I think that the Times today is a greater and more influential newspaper than it was under Ox. One reason for its advancement is the retreat of many other great newspapers. The number of journals which want to be great, instead of great money-makers, grows fewer every day. The pressures increase, fear increases, political activity of publishers increases. The free and independent journals decrease. The Times, despite all its faults, grows more powerful because, while it is not the liberal leader its owners say it is not retreating with the majority of rich newspapers. Without denying Mr. Sulzberger's sincerity and intentions, I still think it fair to say that the Times is not liberal or impartial, and open to hundreds of questions under the canon fair play. I do not ask of Mr. Sulzberger that he publish a liberal paper. I ask him only to publish a newspaper. I ask him to publish a newspaper which will make it impossible for me or anyone else 5 years from now to publish another chapter of criticism such as the foregoing. And that concludes chapters 9 and 10 from Lords of the Press by George Seldes from 1938. You've been listening to Rejected Knowledge. This is Rejected Knowledge. And this is Chapter 9 from Lords of the Press by George Seldes from 1938. Some memory hold history here, rejected knowledge, stuff you're not supposed to know. Chapter 9, entitled Lord Baltimore. If integrity is a luxury, it was well exemplified in the case of Van Lear Black and the Baltimore Sun papers. The Sun and the Evening Sun of Baltimore have always been prominent among the few really great newspapers in America, which can be compared with the Manchester Guardian, the old Frankfurter Zeitung, the dead New York World. Parentheses. All these papers, by the way, were rich men's newspapers. The Guardian, owned by C.P. Scott, the Frankfurter by Sonnenmann, the World by Joseph Pulitzer, and the Baltimore papers by Black, end parentheses. Black was probably the richest individual in the state of Maryland. He was president of the Fidelity and Deposit Company of Baltimore, director of the Consolidated Coal Company, the Massachusetts Mutual Life Insurance Company, the American Ship and Commerce Corporation, American Sugar Refining Company, the Chatham Phoenix National Bank and Trust Company of New York. But did Black present his editors with a list of these corporations with instructions to treat them as sacred cows? Did he instruct his editors to color the news to suit the sugar company or the shipping company? He did not. He not only told his editorial writers, editors and reporters, that they must cover the news truthfully, as most editors do, But he proved to his staff that he was not bluffing, as so many others are doing. The question of the man's integrity is well illustrated in one of the West Virginia coal strikes, where the worst features of labor war in America were to be found, with violence, bloodshed, and murder commonplaces. Mr. Van Leer Black was not only a stockholder in one of the companies, but he was an operator in this field. But that did not deter him from sending two men, a staff reporter and a radical labor advocate, to write the story of the strike. Mr. Black made a bet that when the stories came in, the one from the regular staff man would turn out to be the more radical than that of the radical labor advocate, and he won. But it is to be noted that, 1. The staff man knew he would not be fired, no matter what he wrote, as long as he was convinced it was the truth, and 2. The coal operator published in his own newspaper damning but truthful reports against his own profit interests. Van Leer Black began life as a clerk. In his youth he was interested only in business and finance. He became director of banks, shipping companies, insurance firms. He insured himself for $750,000, and his hobbies were yachting and airplanes. It was as chairman of the board for competitive capitalism. It is the system which most effectively uproots the unfit, the unworthy, the lazy. It is the system which gives place to the vigorous, the competent, the purposeful. Yeah, but it was already dead by the 1930s. What a bunch of hogwash. The robber baron era was done, and the robber barons had already totally taken over the nation. And then they closed the barn doors so nobody could get out of the barn and catch them. With the fraudulent antitrust laws, which all that did was let the robber barons who already escalated to the top do whatever the hell they wanted, and nobody else could catch them. That's what that was all about. Yes, I have documentation. Listen to some of my other shows. Continuing, it is the system which constantly provides room for originality, and thereby constantly enlarges achievement. It is the system which carries technological advance to its rational conclusion of lower prices and increased mass consumption. Bullcrap. Bullcrap. It leads to monopoly and higher prices. Continuing, even as distorted in recent periods, it has produced in this country a degree of well-being which has never been equaled, and in that well-being all classes of men have shared. Bullcrap. Within this system, labor may organize and exercise its rights to bargain collectively. Bullcrap. This system of competition is, moreover, the protection of political liberty. Bullcrap. This is all propaganda. Bullcrap. It is the best protection for the ordinary citizen, the working man. Bullcrap. It is the economic freedom of competition which guards political freedom. Unquote. Bullcrap. Wow. 6 weeks later, or just before the dawn of Election Day, the Baltimore Sun announced that it could not support Landon either. But reaction has run the chariot of the Sun ever since. One of its signs was the appointment of H.L. Mencken as editor of the Evening Sun. One of Mr. Mencken's stunts was to publish 6 columns of dots on the 7-column editorial page with the announcement that there were over 1,075 dots, one for every federal government's, quote, immense core of job holders. If there were no job holders at all, every taxpayer's income would be increased 27%. Such is the bill for being saved from revolution and ruin by Wonder Men. Unquote. In midsummer 1938, Mr. Mencken, retiring as editor, but continuing as columnist, went to Germany for his holiday. The Sun papers still produce excellent pages, still employ numerous editors and correspondents noted for liberalism and intelligence, but there is no millionaire owner today to encourage the staff to produce a great newspaper at the price of disagreeing with the forces of that, quote, competitive capitalism, unquote, which the staff approves, of the A.S. Abel Company, which published the Sun papers, that he became identified with journalism. He never interfered with the capable men he hired to run the papers. It is quite possible that he would never have interfered had the editors made the paper reactionary and servile, but since it is the natural habit of American reporters to produce as free a newspaper as the owner permits, and since in this instance the owner was sympathetic, the result was two great newspapers. Unfortunately, Van Lear Black disappeared from his yacht one night in August 1930. Alive, he had furnished the world press with many stories, notably his 130,000-mile flight to all parts of the world, but in death he furnished a sensation. However, it was soon proved that although he was a drinking man, he had not been drunk, and there was no probability of suicide. The accident had tragic effects on the Sun papers. I wonder if it was really an accident. Continuing. In autumn of 1936, when the reactionary papers joined like howling wolves around a single victim, the New Deal, the two most important deserters from the liberal Democratic camp were the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and the Baltimore Sun papers. Said the Sun, quote, "The Sun now states that in this campaign it is unable to advocate the re-election of President Roosevelt. The statement is made with regret. The Sun stands